the development community is not an actor outside of the society. It is also still dealing with what I would call a colonial hangover, a colonial relic. Given its colonial roots and an equal distribution of power, this sector is the right candidate, I would say, to reflect about racial biases and blind spots. We have seen the transnational waves of anti-racist movement inspired by the Black Lives Matter. It's provided a unique opportunity for a critical reflection. This reflection is what we hope to discuss today is not a matter of charity or paying lip service to calls from the society or activists. Rather, we envision it as a necessary step for the improvement and survival of the development sector as a meaningful and positive actor on the world stage. A new generation of young activists from all the colors has stood up in showing the way, marching across European cities, including here in The Hague, chanting Black Lives Matter. They are calling out to their communities and to us as development practitioners to act, and to act now. We should therefore take the call of these future donors and leaders seriously and acknowledge that we have a responsibility to follow their example and, importantly, to also set an example. Now, it is against this background that Partos, including in collaboration with the broker, decided to organize this online conversation for the Dutch development community. There have been different conversations outside of the country, and I'm very happy that also here in the Netherlands we are able to reflect about these issues. In the coming 2 hours, we'll critically reflect about our blind spot and existing racial biases, but also think about how we as an individual and organizations can overcome these biases and blind spots. And to do this, we invited external speakers who are well-renowned, who will help us and guide us through this process. The first speaker will be Dr. Artea Marie Rivas, who will reflect on the colonial roots of the everyday racism in the development sector. And after her talk, I will interview Annevis Kuipers about experiencing whiteness in the Dutch development sector and her message for the new generation. And before we go to the breakout sessions, we have Dagon Ali, who will talk about the European exceptionalism of race and her experience with everyday racism working with NGOs. And I hope she will also touch on her experience with Dutch NGOs. Maybe for the structure, as I just mentioned, we'll have 2 speakers and between them 1 interview. Maybe after the speakers, we'll have breakout sessions. I would like to invite my colleague Janneke, who will give my colleague Janneke from the broker, who will explain a bit about this idea of breakout sessions and how we aim to approach them.
Thank you, Kisa. Welcome all, as Kisa just said. After the plenary sessions, we will indeed have breakout sessions. We will be divided in various subgroups, and we will have a discussion and a reflection on the presentations that you will listen to shortly. In the breakout sessions, when you take the floor, I would ask you all to briefly introduce your name and your organization. We don't really have time to introduce everyone in depth, but it would be nice to at least know your name and organization. Additionally, we would like to ask the groups themselves to select 2 people, 1 moderator who will facilitate the discussion, and additionally 1 representative who will share after the discussion a key message from your conversation in a final plenary reflection. We will not, in the final plenary reflection, have time to give the floor to everyone. However, there is a public chat. So when your representative of your group is sharing the key points of your group, please do add in the chat and share your reflection, share your experiences, what you think is the key takeaway of your group, because all this information will be taken for a synthesis article that will be published in the weeks following this session. And additionally, it will provide input for possible following sessions in the future. One short message for the people who have joined us today from Partos. You have received an email with the key questions for the subgroups in your mailbox. It would be great if you could share those in the chat of your subgroup so that the key questions are known to all subgroups. These will be shared here in the public space. I believe you can all find them when you click on the little screen button in the right lower corner of your screen. You can see a presentation, and there you already have the main questions, but these will also be shared from Partos and by Kisa and myself in the subgroups. All right, that was it from me, I think, unless Kisa, you have any thing to add or I forgot anything. You're still on mute.
Maybe on the idea of safe space.
Right. Very important addition. Thank you. We all know that this is not an easy topic. We really hope that you are willing and able to share your experiences and your thoughts freely. So we find it really important to stress that this is a safe space. We hope that we can have a conversation based on respect. As you will see in the upper part of your screen, the current session is being recorded. However, this is only for our own personal use for the synthesis article. It will not be shared publicly, nor will your names or organizations be published in the synthesis article. So it's, in that sense, all private. And I'll give you the floor, Kisa.
Yes, the same goes with the private conversation in the breakout sessions, because envisionedly this event was only organized for Partos members, but somehow it got a wider attention, and we also have like people from universities in this conversation and even from the ministry. But we still hope that during the breakout session there will be a room to share your doubts and challenges as an organization, and how you deal with this conversation and share with others. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Artea Marie Rivas. Dr. Artea Marie Rivas is lecturer at the School of African and Oriental Studies, SOAS, in London, University of London in Development Studies. Her work focuses on politics of violence, humanitarian intervention, post-conflict reconstruction, and transitional justice. Her academic work is complemented by 12 years of professional experience in diplomacy, development, gender relations and equality, and humanitarian action in Central Asia and East and West Africa. As I mentioned before, her talk will reflect on the colonial roots of everyday racism in the development sector. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kisa. Firstly, I'd like to thank Kisa and his colleagues at The Broker and Partos for inviting me to participate in the workshop today, and for all the hard work that they must have put into making this event happen. So I worked in the development industry for 12 years, as Kiza just said, before starting my PhD. And I still work with various organizations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I'm a big believer in linking theory to practice to action. So I always look forward to events where I can engage with people working in the field to think about and discuss important issues and to try and push the boundaries of the frameworks that we use to think about development and to practice development. Because for me, these conversations are really the spaces that are fundamental to creating positive and even radical change. And really that's where the hope for development, I think, lies. So critical scholars have traced the origins of development thoughts, kind of copying its racist tendencies and racialized anxieties onto the post-colonial world. Yet within development policy circles, there's kind of a loud silence about the entanglements of race, racism, and development. In fact, there's almost a passionate denial of the ways in which racial discrimination and colonial violence and its legacies are fundamental to the emergence and continued everyday practice of development. And there's some common assumptions that are made, and two common assumptions are, one, that development takes place in non-racialized spaces. And this means that even though race exists as a social construction in our world in general, it's not a determining factor in the way that people relate to each other or how development institutions function locally or globally. Another assumption is that development takes place outside of racialized histories, meaning that though the discourse of race may have played a role in the history of development, specifically genocide and slavery and colonialism, the emergence of the development project, there's no continuity between those historical processes and development practices and discourses today. But these silences and assumptions have obstructed our understanding of the prominence of racialized discourse and practice in development and the embodied experience of racialization for aid workers and for communities and individuals who are the so-called beneficiaries or targets of aid. However, as the speakers before me have pointed out, the recent Black Lives Matter protests have led for a call for direct engagement with these issues. So today I'm going to address three questions that I think are important for people to think about and to reflect on to understand the relationship between race, racism, and international development. And the first question is, what is the historical relationship between race and development? So in the colonial imaginary, the territories encountered during exploratory journeys were prime opportunities for exploitation and settlement. Right? So the non-European societies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean that provided a basis for European development and capitalist expansion, both through slavery and colonial extraction, were kind of constructed in opposition to Europe. So upon encountering the natives, the Europeans adapted racial constructions that would justify their actions. These racial categories were used to legitimize conquest and exploitation and generated specific forms of social relations based on hierarchy and superiority of Eurocentric ways of doing and being. The categories were authoritative and acted as signifiers of power that associated, amongst other things, blackness with backwardness and acknowledged the existence of colonial nations, but without acknowledging that they had a history or that they were important or substantive in any other way. So once Europe conquered and colonized the rest of the world, it then kind of imposed its own ontology that displaced and dispossessed others. The others were to signify separateness, primitiveness, backwardness, and difference. But yet they were also at the same time totally visible and totally known by the Europeans in their own discourse. So in the European imagination then, it was only through the colonial relationship with Europe that colonies became visible and acquired the potential to become less primitive. Then at the beginning of the post-World War II era, colonial powers embarked on an extensive development agenda, paradigm programs throughout Africa and Asia. Okay, so Copper and Lees are scholars who have documented the history of development thought and practice beginning in the 19th century and its literal translation into development theory in a post-colonial world. So though development wasn't explicitly named development or international development until the 1940s, during the 19th century, similar ideas were contained in the various policies of colonial nations. So for example, the French policy of constructive exploitation replaced the idea of expansion and plunder as the official French colonial policy in the 1890s. the British used another term called constructive imperialism. And that was kind of a response to the decline of empire, which envisioned building one progressive, united empire. So where imperialism and empire was constructive, not destructive. So such policies suggested a softer form of imperialism, where extraction was not the only task, but it occurred alongside more altruistic social programming. And herein is the birth of the International Development Project. So these constructed divisions that justified the colonial project were then reproduced in a new development project, as the primitive and backwards mapped on in the new development speak to becoming the underdeveloped, the third world, and the poor. Unsurprisingly then, development, just as colonialism and slavery, depended upon and still depends upon the reproduction of racialized and gendered hierarchies that rely upon dichotomous thinking about the West and the rest, or the global North and the global South. So the second question, okay, so race was part of development's history, but is race an issue in development today? So the colonial history and legacy upon which international development discourse and practice is built continues to reproduce racialized spaces and to reinforce asymmetrical power relations in new and complex ways today in everyday development encounters. Okay? It has established a system and a discourse and practices that perpetuate the very inequalities that it claims to address. Meanwhile, the impact of white supremacy continues to just become more and more entrenched within the development sector. Black lives have been fundamental to the story, the justification, and the maintenance of the development industry. Racial hierarchies are maintained and mediated through the imaginaries of the theater of aid, where aid workers, often imagined as white, European, or Americans, seek to soothe the poor and racialized, an act that simultaneously reaffirms their difference in superiority and white privilege, and their altruism. So it's not to say that all aid workers are racist. Some are, for sure, but there are many aid workers who are dedicated to addressing global challenges, like poverty, violence, and hunger. However, we must recognize that the international development aid architecture is fundamentally dependent upon ideas of white supremacy, and therefore racist behavior and practices not only go unchecked, but are actually necessary to fuel this project, whose life force is dependent upon the idea that capacity, that resources, and knowledge are naturally linked to whiteness, and that those qualities at best can only be transferred or introduced to those others if they reach the stage of maturity to accept it. The representations of Blackness as being embodied by poverty and ignorance, and the impunity for racist speech and practices that the international development aid architecture affords, reassures aid workers of their subject position, while still allowing them to claim some sort of moral superiority, altruism, or awareness. It allows for action without disruption to notions of white supremacy. It is upon this narrative that the image of the white savior is maintained. So if we think about the ways in which capacity building is completely divorced often from local contexts, or the number of times you've sat in on conversations where shock and dismay are expressed at how these people, quote unquote, or the locals organize their lives, how they treat their women, an emotional response which reinforces the necessity of aid workers and their superiority. To disrupt this equation would be to fundamentally undo the structures of aid. Linked to this are underlying beliefs and practices that Black bodies can be disposable or over-sexualized and devalued. And here we cannot ignore the connections between the death of George Floyd, police brutality, the structures of white supremacy which uphold the military-industrial aid complex, private security sector, and the impunity of aid workers who commit sexual violence. So yes, race is a real issue in development today. And the last question, why is it so hard to talk about race in development? Ultimately, there is no white privilege without Black suffering. So while one can understand intellectually that racism is bad or evil even, perhaps for many in the aid sector, the destabilization of white supremacy is even worse. Kiza, do I have 2 more minutes? 2 more minutes? Okay. So even with the focus on equitable partnerships or localization, while emphasizing some sort of valid aims and necessary changes, it doesn't contest the pervasiveness of whiteness and the practices of extraction and exclusion within the development sector. But as aid workers begin to understand more about the colonial and epistemic violence and white privilege that is embedded in the development sector, they often try to reclaim some position of criticality or moral high ground. That's often because they want the bad feelings to go away, right? It's a difficult topic. But also, they don't want to lose the entitlements of thinking about their ways of living and knowing and being as being superior to those others. Or they try to deflect the conversation and discuss, racism that exists between groups or ethnic conflicts, or the conflicts between local communities and the diaspora, or absolve themselves of responsibility through comparisons between other European countries, the difference between the French and the British approach, between the Scandinavians and the Germans, or between Europe and America. But these are efforts to not address their own complicity in the role and maintenance of racialized inequalities and development, and even their own racism. So we need to be willing to sit in discomfort with unsettling thoughts and failure and work through these things. It's important to resist the imperative to reproduce and resolve complex problems with uncomplicated solutions. Instead, we need to sit with and learn from the discomfort, and that is the only way to move forward, and reflecting on our own role in collaboration and investment in these systems. Because there is a way that fragility can take over when white people are confronted with their own complicity in racism, or the ways in which they benefit from white privilege. And I think these are common responses, but it's important to think through what these responses tell us about our own positionality and the desires that we want to move past. So just to wrap up, I just want to take us back to the recent killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, that have sparked protests all over the world, but also reflect anger, but they also reflect hope. Okay, so this is a moment that has pushed conversations about the value of Black lives and race. And I think for the development sector, there's an opportunity here, right, to create platforms in which to speak about race and racism like we're in today, that will allow us to interrogate these issues, but also which will allow us to rethink development not as charity or as an assistance, but through the lens of justice, perhaps social justice or reparative justice. So right now there is a demand for a different type of development project that is tied to the calls globally for abolition and for recognition and dismantling of racial structures and institutions that permeate our societies locally and globally. And ultimately, the development industry has to face its history and the continued entanglements with race, racism, and white supremacy, because those silences that I spoke of at the beginning of my talk may not be allowed to persist anymore. So as Gloria Wenker, who's a Dutch scholar, a Black Surinese Dutch scholar, says, the point of knowing racial ignorance and white innocence has long passed. Now is the time to change.
For now, I'd like to invite Annevis. Annevis, please, could you join the conversation? Maybe a short introduction, and I'll ask Annevis to introduce herself, because she has more than 20 years experience in the development sector. Annevis, is that right? I understood more than 40 years.
I went to Burkina Faso in '86 and stayed there for 13 years, and doing there different things, in most of it in the same project for 9 years, a project on environment business. For SNV, I worked there, but before that, I studied development studies, geography, and after 5 years in Partos now, where we mixed innovation and development in a nice way to connect people.
Yeah, we thought it was a good way for people watching. Annevis just retired last week from Partos, so it's really good to have you here. As you know, this sector, at least from a Dutch perspective, more than anyone, especially with some young people like Lotte we just saw. How do you look back in after those more than 20 years?
Now, I remember when we started the program, I just came fresh from the university, and we came in a provincial town, and we were supposed to do work on the environment and the improved wood stoves. So there was a whole team of extension workers they recruited, and so we sat down and we were talking about what are we going to do. So I asked them, because I knew I didn't know anything about the environment there and neither how they cook, etc. But then there was a silence, and then they said, but you are the expert. You come here to tell us what to do. And I found that very difficult. And then I realized that we were seen as experts because of our skin color, because also there was a difference in education. I did university and they didn't. But there's also, of course, the power relation of having more money, or they think you have more money. You have also, but yeah, it's all a relative thing. But I've found that very difficult to cope with and to get the trust to work together and really learn from each other. So that was the first experience. I found it very difficult.
And this was 1986, I understand, and now we are in 2020. We are Black Lives Matter, and we are having this conversation, which was maybe unimaginable 20 years ago. Do you think that this mechanism, we just heard from Dr. Rivas, do you think that these mechanisms are reproduced in 2020? This idea of whiteness and you being better because you come from Europe, you know everything.
It all has to do also, I think, with education. For example, where I was in Burkina Faso, I hope it changed, but when we were there, the French style of education was take all by heart and don't think for yourself. So that's also a thing that I hope it changed, so people are also allowed to make their own reflections and their decisions. So I don't know whether it's really changed. I fear that a lot of it is still the same. And I hear some examples, and I heard some examples last years that I was thinking, what the heck are we doing there? So I fear it's not really changed. And about what you said, that we didn't have this kind of discussion before, that's not true. When I was in Africa, of course you talked about the difference.
But not in the Netherlands. And I asked the question because I'm wondering whether if you look in the Dutch development sector, do you think that we have had any form of development on our consciousness when it comes to our whiteness, experiencing, I just say whiteness, this Western dominance?
Yeah, I suppose in university the way of talking and speaking, but there's also, I know somebody who did a research on what the students now in development studies get like literature, and it's a lot of literature of old white men still that they have to read. But there is a lot of literature and research done also by people from the global South. But in university, it's not very often used. That's also weird.
Maybe the last question on this, because we have, as I mentioned, the new generation. Last week was your last week. What will be your message, your key message you would want them to take away? Also in relation to the conversation about racism, race, whiteness.
Yeah, be humble, do not assume, ask questions, be curious, and don't suppose you know anything, because nothing is like it seems to be. So you have to dig and to be really interested in the other, and the other that could be a white one also, but other in general. Yeah. I think that's very important.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Annelies. We should be humble and be interested. The other can also know.
That's it.
I think that's a beautiful message. Thank you very much. For now, we have around, actually, we have about 10 minutes. So this is a challenge before we go to the breakout session. But I would like to invite my next speaker, Dagon Ali. Please welcome Dagon. Maybe a short introduction. Dagon is the executive director of Adesso, a bigger Kenyan NGO, and she has more than 20 years of experience hands-on experience in humanitarian and development field. She's a strong believer in transforming the current aid system, and she has given different talks about that in the past month and years to give more power and voice to the local community and civil society organizations. Following this belief, Dagon continues to innovate and develop new solutions to build infrastructure that will truly shift power and resources. She is, for instance, really a pioneer on cash transfers program in Kenya, including the co-founding of the Network for Empowerment Aid Response, or NEAR. And in her talk, she will talk about the European exceptionalism on race and her experience with everyday racism. And I hope she will give us some experience with Dutch NGOs. Dagon, the floor is yours. In the meantime, please write questions in the chat, and I will select the few questions for Dagon. 10 minutes is challenging, Dagon, knowing you, but I'm sure you will bring us through your journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's good to be invited, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Yeah, 10 minutes is hard. I'll try to do this in 10 minutes. And sorry, I'm in Nairobi and my Wi-Fi is not the best, especially with video. So if it's a bit dodgy, I will remove the video at some point. So my experience with racism in the aid sector, well, it's quite a lot. I think I could write an entire book. At one point in the future, I will write a book about my experience with racism in the sector. But I want to just tell a few stories for many of you who are development practitioners and aid workers with good intentions. First of all, one thing, I'm a Somali American, so I left Somalia as a child and I went to the US. So from the moment I landed in the US, I was very, very clear and physically engaging with racism on a daily basis as a child up until my adulthood when I left the US. And it was very easy to have conversations about racism in the US in context. They haven't solved their problems, but it was much easier to have those conversations and to confront it. Whereas when I got into the aid sector, what I found kind of shocking and surprising was this almost like purposeful blinders that many Europeans have placed on themselves on purpose, I guess, to not have a conversation around racism. The idea is that if you're a humanitarian and you sacrifice your nice house, you're willing to go to Africa and live in a village with no running water or good electricity. If you're making these personal sacrifices to help those Black people or brown people, then by definition, you must be a good person. And if you must be a good person, you must be not racist, yeah? And there's a very deep linkage between white saviorism and the humanitarian and development space. And nobody wants to ever accept that somehow there's issue of racism and power involved here. And it's like, oh, Americans are racist, and I don't belong to any neo-Nazi group. And it's only extreme examples, or you hear things like, there's no such thing as race biologically, and all types of excuses, the things Artea was talking about, before even having an honest conversation, forget about even confronting it. So for me, it's a bit ironic that it's taken, in my 20 plus years being in the system, it's taken us this moment of George Floyd's death and many other killings of Black bodies for us to have this conversation. It's quite shocking and tragic that it has to be this. But whatever has caused this moment to happen, it's an important conversation, and it's a must for us to be uncomfortable to have it and to do it well. No road worth traveling is ever easy. And I think it's also, someone mentioned, you know, talking about racism and talking about decolonization and talking about all of this very important history and how it's interlinked with white privilege and with the aid sector and white saviorism and all of these things. You know, it also should be seen as as Stephanie Kamal said, you know, as an act of love. It's not meant to be seen as an act of hate. It's meant to be seen as a way to really interrogate our humanity and our experiences, being the victim of white power and white supremacy. So, so having said that, I mean, I can give you many examples. So here's very practical things that happen to people of color on the other side as aid recipients from local organizations. First of all, I've been called a liar in a public meeting because we presented information about a drought using our own data, and our own data was immediately disparaged. I remember a white man from UNICEF actually calling me a liar in a public meeting with the UN and INGOs there. Nobody ever defended me. Nobody ever stood up for me. Nobody said anything that you can't do that, as unacceptable behavior, nothing. The room was completely silent, and I had to defend myself in a sea of white people. That was one first experience. Constantly being told you can't be trusted with money because local organizations are risky. Risky is what? Is code for corrupt. That's the code, what it is for. That if you're a black and brown person, you can't be trusted with money because you're corrupt. Let me tell you, my first experience with corruption in the sector was from a UNICEF staff member asking for a bribe. It was a UN agency. I have seen extraordinary amounts of corruption in UN agencies and INGOs. And what happens? There's a major INGO, I don't want to name names, in 2011 during the famine that had a massive corruption scandal, which I personally warned them about. I told them there are things that are happening in your programs that you need to investigate. They refused to accept it. And then it came out, it became public. What happened? Well, what happened was they were, the donor actually enabled them to hide it and push it under the rug. Why? Under the banner of, we don't want the Guardian or the Daily Mail to have an article about corruption in Somalia and money going to Al-Shabaab, because, you know, if the taxpayers learn this, then you never know, we'll get our aid cut. So in the name of keeping this aid money flowing, you hide corruption, you don't clean up the system, you do everything possible to continue the status quo. That organization, for mismanaging years and years of corruption, was actually rewarded and became one of the largest INGOs in Somalia as of today. And what simultaneously what happens for a local organization? Adesso had a similar incident. We weren't corrupt. We reported on a corruption case of one of our local NGO partners in a consortium with us. We whistleblowed. What happened to the whistleblower? We were blacklisted, not for stealing any money, but because we had a partner in a consortium and we found out about incidences of corruption. But when an international agency has their own incidences of corruption, which are, I can't even tell you the number of corruption issues I have seen personally from white people, Kenyan staff, Somali staff, all the way from the top to the bottom, because it's easy. The tendency is to say it's local staff. No. White people enabled this. White people were part of this. White people are benefiting from it because white people know if they try to clean up the system, it means that they will be out of a job, that their donors might not support them, and all of these things. They're enabling this corrupt, completely oppressive system to continue because it's in their own interest. The incentive structure is not there to clean up the system. The incentive structure is there to perpetuate itself. And so to constantly say, oh, it's national staff who are the problem. No, it's not national staff. We just had an incident of a major INGO enabling corruption for a long, long time by a regional white director, knowing about it, being complicit in it, and allowing it to happen. But then it's okay to paint all local NGOs as corrupt. I'm sorry, but when you are benefiting from it financially, actually your corruption is even more severe than the local guy who may go away with $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000, but you are getting away with millions of funding, millions and millions of funding. Yeah. So we could talk about aid porn. We could talk about how is it that we still up to today haven't normalized the possibility of white beneficiaries in videos. Why don't we have videos and pictures and images of white people? Why is it that it's always a white person giving something to a black child or a black woman? You know, aid porn is a great, very easy example. And many of your fundraising staff refuse to stop it because it knows it makes money. Why? Because it's part of that culture that wants that thinks that they have to support, but that's white saviorism, they have to support this unhealthy, meek looking black child. You see, it's part of that culture of white supremacy, and you're perpetuating it in your fundraising every single day and making millions off of it. You see, so let's talk about the political nature of aid. Where is the solidarity with international NGOs in truly addressing the politicalness of aid? There's no discussion about why is it another European member country such as France basically is still colonizing 14 African countries. Why is it that nobody talks about this? Why is it that civil society in Europe, you guys in Holland and your counterparts in France are not talking about how you have human rights, you have all of these EU things that you try to shove down the throats of our countries, but you don't practice that? Where is the fairness of treatment when you don't hold France accountable for basically stealing trillions of dollars on the back of poor black West African children? Yeah. So these are the kinds of things. So this is what I'm saying. Aid is very political, but it's very easy to act like it's not political. It's very easy to make money off of it. And you yourself, your organization, and you as an individual are very complicit in ensuring the poverty of my people. Yeah.
So what I understand is that we are not only talking about race and imagery, but also about power structures, and especially also the economics and the politics. We have around 3 minutes. I see Alexander, who just confirmed follow the money. Maybe for the last 3 minutes before we go in the breakout sessions, because I can imagine that this is an uncomfortable conversation, Dagon. And you have been having these conversations. What have you discovered in the past month talking to Western NGOs, telling this story as passionate as you just did?
Yeah, it's like 20 years. I'm getting a little tired, but what I've discovered in the past 1 month is that people are genuinely willing to have these conversations. I'm not really as hopeful in genuine change. I think it's really an institution. There's so much, as I said, incentive structures, an organization to really devolve power and money to local communities means that they have to become smaller. It means that all of these positions in the headquarters have to downsize. It means you have to give decision-making to Black and brown people in those countries and partners. It means so many things. It means, and these are very, very difficult decisions for organizations to make. It's very difficult for a CEO of an Oxfam Novib or Save the Children in Holland to make those kinds of decisions, to say, you as a board have to allow me to become smaller. You have to allow me to give more of our unrestricted money to our partners. You have to allow me to take more political positions on the quality of aid. You have to allow me to become more radical in our demands of the EU, and we have to form a coalition and hold the French government accountable. You have to allow me to risk the funding we would receive from the EU by making those political decisions. That's a very very difficult and courageous position, and not many CEOs and boards are there, in my opinion.
I hope that people who are present will take this message to the CEOs. I see a lot of positive notes in the chat on your speech, Dagon. I would like to thank you very much. I hope you are open to join one of the breakout sessions where we'll reflect on your contribution and the contribution of Dr. Rivas. So for now on, I think time is going to divide us in the breakout sessions. Dagon, I'd like to thank you again for your powerful speech.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's my pleasure.